Missouri. Michael, what was the stresses that your system was facing? What was the strategy you employed? And most importantly, why did you choose that strategy?
Well, sure. Just so for everyone's benefit, a few months ago, we were facing funding that was second to last in the United States, where 49th Mississippi is 50th in terms of the funding dedicated to indigent defense. Our caseloads across the state and our 31 trial offices, made up of 376 attorneys statewide, had risen from 74,000 cases last year to 82,000 cases. We weren't seeing any new money. We have a very conservative legislature that gave us the largest increase that we've received in more than 2 decades of $4.5 million. Still wouldn't have advanced us from 49th to 48th in terms of indigent funding. That's how far down we are. But nonetheless, it would have provided substantial relief. The governor withheld that funding from us, said that revenues weren't coming in as expected, and cut the money from our budget. I perused our statutes, 600-042 sub 5, and a never before used statute says that the director of the public defender system has the authority to appoint any lawyer in good standing in the state to represent an indigent client. And I said, well, we're going to have to start using this, and shouldn't we start with the one person in the state that's causing this problem? And so I appointed the governor, as many of you know, and that's only because we needed to bring attention to this problem. We needed to bring attention to the fact that during his tenure from 2006, when the Department of Corrections budget was $575 million, which is no small chunk of change for Missouri, increased to $727 million. This is an average of $30 million per year, and no one blinked an eye. We needed to call attention to this. You know, sometimes people say, well, where's the money for public defender systems? It pays for itself. Just from the 1 year, 2006 to 2007, the Department of Corrections budget increase, just the annual increase, was $45 million. That's $5 million more than my annual operating budget. So we needed to pull attention to this, where the rising prison costs, 150 million over 10 years increase, and not a single new dollar for the public defender systems. And you start looking at the bottom states in terms of the bottom 10 states in terms of public defender funding. And by and large, those are the same states that are top 10 per capita in prison funding. So the correlation is obvious, and we need to draw attention to this. And I think we succeeded in that. He hasn't released the funding, so we have that to deal with. But we had to resort to that, something of a political maneuver, because no one else was paying attention. And I think in Missouri, we got the conversation started.
And what do you see as the strategy moving forward from this point?
Well, I think the strategy for us is much like Texas dealt with in 2008, and it became a fiscal discussion, and I think that's where we are in Missouri. It's a very fiscally conservative state, and the argument on providing the right to counsel because it's the right thing, and the need to have a balanced system of justice where there's equal rights under the law, that train has left the station, and it's not resonating with legislators and governors in my state. What does resonate is the fiscal argument, that increase of the Department of Corrections budget that I talked about. Also, the cost to the counties. We talked about New York having 62 counties, and even there, for a state of 19 million people, the general consensus is there's too many counties. Now, by contrast, Missouri is fewer than 6 million people, and we have 114 counties, a very sparse population. And so there's lots of counties, and the biggest operating expense for the counties is their local jail, okay? Their local jail. They can't afford it, but they want it. And because the judiciary kind of wholesale ignores bond limitations, they put that, most people get, if you're poor, you get incarceration pre-trial, and that's just the way it is. But at the first day that they're in jail pre-trial, the county starts accumulating costs, significant costs, particularly if there's a mental health issue or a drug addiction. And these are costs that the county simply cannot sustain. And I think Missouri is unique in this. I may be wrong, but there's one policy that's at the heart of this whole problem. And that is the way that a county in Missouri gets reimbursed for their jail costs is if the person ultimately gets a state prison sentence. Think about that for a moment. There's a financial incentive for counties to sentence someone to state prison. And so the county electeds, the sheriff, the prosecutor, and the judge are no doubt at the Elks Lodge on a Friday night having Bud Light saying, we need some money. We got to balance our budget. You got to give these guys a state prison sentence. And that's invariably what happens. So 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, when during the State of the Union, the president said it was the first time in recent memory where the national prison population went down contemporaneous with the national crime rate. Well, Missouri, that didn't happen. In fact, our crime rate went up, particularly violent crime, as did our prison population, and we are now knocking on the door of needing a new prison at $140 million plus FTEs. So my argument is now a fiscal one. You want to avoid having to buy that new prison at $140 million, and Missouri's not really looking to do massive criminal justice reform? Well, fund the public defender system, which is oftentimes not part of the conversation when we're talking about righting the ship on mass incarceration. Just to borrow a simple sports metaphor, if you're a hockey or a soccer fan, pull your goalie. Pull your goalie. And there's going to be a lot of balls going in the net that shouldn't go in the net. Same is true with the public defender system. If you have, as we do, 82,000 cases, which represents 250 cases at any one time for a public defender, you cannot provide substantive representation for them. And you, by and large, you are just meeting and pleading them, and the prison population, as a result, is artificially increasing.
Most people will agree that there is a focus on criminal justice reform in this country. And in many ways, your state was ground zero with Ferguson. Can you talk about how the right to counsel plays into this larger narrative of public safety and over-incarceration and the focus on where things are going coming out of Ferguson?
Sure. As many of you know, Ferguson gave rise to a pretty robust discussion, not just on the use of force with respect to law enforcement, but also the chronic and systemic abuse of fines and fees on the indigent population. In Missouri, we're a low tax state, okay? The death knell for any politician is to suggest, even in jest, to raise taxes for needed services. And so the way they fund government, particularly local government, is through excessive fines and fees. And so in Ferguson, which is one of 90 municipalities that make up the larger St. Louis area, you have these very, very small governments that represent not a very large tax base that are entirely funded based on fining and feeing someone. They don't cut their lawn, $50. They don't pay their fee, $75 service charge, so on and so forth. And then when they get pulled over, they're invariably housed in the local jail for however long. And then wouldn't you know it, when they're too poor to get out by making bond, they're responsible for their own jail stay to the tune of $40 per day. So it's a little bit of a head scratcher. I think in addition to the fiscal argument, we need to talk about how public defenders play a role in the larger public safety discussion. In the adversarial system, public defenders, only if we're funded adequately, can help the system distinguish between who they need to spend money on and who they don't need to spend money on. Probation and parole and corrections, it's really expensive, okay? The last thing you want to do is waste those finite critical resources on individuals who don't need it. Okay? It keeps you from doing things on the front end, like eliminating your rape kit backlog, or executing warrants, or solving unsolved violent crime. And so what the public defender system does for the larger public safety discussion is, through the adversarial process, we're going to help you figure out who you don't need to pay attention to and who you do need to pay attention to. And and oftentimes that's not discussed. That's not part of the discussion. I think we need to make it part of the discussion.